What's going on, everybody? Excited to talk to you today about default values specifically associated to data properties within Power Apps components. Now, these are new, associated to the enhanced property types of data input and output. So we're going to talk about how you can use those default values as fallbacks, and you can set them up as contracts and all kinds of stuff. So let's dive in. All right, just a little bit about me. Again, my name is David Warner. I run a blog and YouTube site, warner.digital, work for Quisitive. I'm an MVP, I'm an MCT, but most importantly, I am the biggest fan of all of you in the community. I love working with you, love working on programs like the recognition program and sharing is caring. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. Don't be shy. Let's collaborate together. Let's get more involved in some community conversations and collaborations, and look forward to working with each and every one of you. All right, so what is on our agenda for this video? As promised, we are going to start talking about default values in relation to enhanced properties for components. So we're going to go over the default values overview documentation, just a quick little overview on what it is and what they are, how we can use them, some key features and benefits. And then we're going to get directly into a demo around data properties. Now, these properties are specifically for basic input-output data, as you could imagine. Hey, I know data, and it's going to go in and out of our components. So first things first, the documentation here on the left, what you see here on the left, this is literally the entire documentation for default values. So it's a little light, and that's okay. It's an opportunity for us to kind of explore and discover what's capable. I'm not going to read it all to you. You can pause it if you'd like and read it, but pretty basic information it provides. So if we move over to the right and look at the key benefits, what are some of the things that we want to look out for if this was translated into benefits? Well, it's required and optional contracts between the component and the app. And what does that mean, required and optional? We'll talk about that. Don't worry. It's depending on the type of property you're using. It provides fallback values when no input is given. So if you're not making it a required value on your property or parameter, then you could have a fallback. But it also ensures consistent behavior across your component instances, can help establish clear data schema. So for example, if you're using records and you've got very specific data in your record that you need, it provides that clarity, which is super valuable. And then it simplifies user interactions by, again, setting that expectation of values up front. Now, one thing to think about is when you're passing values and you've got default values already in place, for example, within your component, you can fall back to those. So if no value is provided, you can fall back to them. But if you do provide anything, like for example, if you've got a record that's got 5 different key value pairs in them and you only provide 2, it's not going to fall back to the 3 you didn't, right? So it's kind of an all or nothing package. So think about that. And then it must obviously comply with the data type or the return data type of the property. So if you set up your property to be of type record, which we'll see in this demo, then it's going to expect a record. You try to pass it just plain text or an image or something like that, it's going to give you some grief and tell you, no, sorry, I'm waiting for something else, and it's a record. So again, those are hard and fast requirements, which are actually very, very good, right? Make sure that your component is getting the data it's expecting. Now, it's also valuable to note that these benefits and requirements cover all of the enhanced properties, right? Whether you're using action or event or data or function, all of these benefits and requirements are associated to the default values for all those types of properties, right? So this documentation you're looking at on the left, that's applicable to everything. So now, though, let's take a look at the benefits and factors to consider for data properties. So there's a kind of sort of maybe contract between the component and the app, and you're like, what? This is programming. There can't be a kind of sort of maybe contract, but there is for this property type only. And why? I don't know. We'll talk about it more in the demo. I don't know if this is a bug or if it's intentional, but we'll see how to handle it. And it's not that big a deal, but we'll see how to handle it. But it also provides predefined values for data-related properties, obviously, right? So it makes it super easy to be able to test in that case, because you can make the assumption you're going to get those values. And so you could also use the input default values elsewhere in your app or your component, depending on whether you're using output or input, right? Point is that you can expect those to be available in your component if there's an input property. And so being that you have already set up the default values, you can go use it in other areas of your component. We'll see what that looks like. Now, key factors to consider. you can use input, output, or any combination of both, right? It's not like you have to use one or the other. We're going to see how we're going to use them together in the demo. You don't have to use them together. You don't have to use any combination, or you can use any combination. You could also use all of them together, like meaning that you could have input, output, action, event. You could get, cornucopia or a plethora of properties types, and if you want it, that's okay. The data type is obviously enforced. We talked about that as the overview. So if it's a record must be supplied. And inside of action and event, when you set up return data types, that creates a round trip experience. You don't get that option with input and output, but if you use them together, it kind of creates a pseudo round trip experience. So not as good as actions or events, but still possible. So kind of keep that in mind. It provides a lot of creativity that you can really do. So that's kind of cool. Now, for our demo, let me just set the context, right? We're going to pass a record about our badges. We've kind of been consistent in our demos and our videos on this topic around badge data. So we're going to stay with that theme. So we're going to pass record about these upcoming May the 4th badges. They're going to be a lot of fun. So we're going to create a data or an input data property to pass record in data into the component. And then we're going to create an output data property to pass record data. And we're going to use default properties in and around that. So we're going to identify how those default properties can be used inside the component and the app using each of those individually input and output data property types. All right, let's get in there. All right, so here we are inside of a component library. Let me just set the context real quick. We are going to be focusing on data values or default values for data props. So that's my component. Over on the screen side, I have a screen already set up specifically for that. I've got my component already added to the screen and renamed appropriately so that I can reference it easily. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come over to our component and we're going to set up a custom property. So we're going to set this up as an input. It's going to be of type data, and I'm just going to call it input record property. And so because of that, we're going to set the data type to record. When I do that and create it, if I go look at the actual values that it pre-creates for us, it just gives us a simple sample record, right? So it's a record with a string, a number, and a Boolean field. And that's fine. You could set it whatever you want. This is just the sample that it gives us. So I'm going to replace that. And I'm going to set it up with just something that's a little bit more in theme for me. And this is going to be some information about our badges. Our new Star Wars themed May the 4th badge is pretty cool. I like them, so you'll see more about them here. But it's just going to include badge name, which is text, badge URL, which is also text, but it's text to an image, so we'll reference it like an image. And then just a sample number field, total badges earned. So that's what we're going to set up as our default value. Now, once I've configured this, meaning that I have defined what my default schema structure should look like. In this case, I'm using a record, decided to use a record. You could use any other data type that you want, but I decided to use a record because I feel like it is probably more the complex side, maybe more of the realistic side that we're going to use. I can reference these values in other places inside my component now, right? So for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add and insert an image field, right? Get out of here. I'm going to say image, right? So when I go in here, now instead of sample image, I can say default. And so I'm going to reference my component here. Says right there what I got. So I'm going to reference that defaults dot, and then I'm able to reference the input record. And then because it knows that those are values it's expecting, it gives me options using the dot notation, right? Availability. So what's cool is I can come in here and I can say, okay, dot badge URL, and now it shows me that image because it knows that the text it's getting back, it references and resolves it and sees that it's an image and it displays it. So inside of my component, I can reference that input property. So now the reason it's showing that is because we're referencing the default value. Remember on the actual property, if I come up here and look at that property, that's the URL right here. That's all still baked into the component. So nothing's really dynamic about this yet. We're not passing anything in from the app to the component, but let's do that next. So when I go back over to my screen, you can see it's displaying that. It's as expected, right? I've got that item dropped there. I'll move it up a little bit here. I've got that item there dropped, so it is referencing that. But if I go into that property now, close that, we can see that those default values are there for us to use. So I can simply replace that URL with something else. And now that URL that I replaced it with is may the open source be with you, different badge, right? So now it's displaying inside of the component what I've now passed in. There's the default value that I passed in, and that's fine. It would use that if I didn't change anything. Of course, you can see I can see that from this side as well. On the app side, I was able to see exactly what default values were there. It wasn't like I had to guess. I just simply replaced it with something else, and now that image is being displayed. And if I go back over to the component side still shows that default value because it really doesn't know. We're looking at the development side of the component. And now the screen is emulating what it would look like inside of an app, right? So we're able to kind of see that there. So that really kind of sums up the input properties of a component when you're talking about the default values. Not a lot of complexity. We're just simply defining what we would like the user to pass in or the app maker to pass in, and we're giving them an example as such. There is some specific details about it we'll cover in a minute, but first I want to cover output, because you could also set up default values with output properties as well. We'll do that within the exact same component here. So let's take a look. We're going to start out by simply going back into our component. And I'm going to create a new custom property. In this case, we're going to stay with data. I'm going to set it to output, and I'm going to change the data type to also record. All right, so I'm going to change this. I'm just going to name it output record property, just something simple. And we'll say create, and I'll go into that default value. So again, because we identified it as a record type, it will predefine or pre-provide an existing data set, right? So again, it's always kind of the same for now: simple sample or sample string field, sample number field, sample boolean field. So we're going to replace that again. Fork awakens our badge URL. Total badges earn 10. So this is what it's going to output then to the actual app as the default value. So now what we can do is we can go back over into our app. We can create an image and we can reference that output. So right now up here, we've got our component, right? And that's outputting what we identified in the component. We've changed it here with the input that is using the input property, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert an image. This is inside the app. Move that down to the bottom here. And for that, I am going to reference my data defaults comp, right? So that is the actual component that I added onto my app. So I'm going to reference that data, and I'm going to reference the output record property. And now, again, using that dot notation, because it understands that it's passing that as the default value for a record, I can reference any one of those record properties or record items, right? So I can come in here and I can do dot, and select URL. And now I see the fork awakens. Now they're different, remember, because the output property is separate from the input property. So in the output property, I included the reference to the fork awakens image, right? But in here, while the default of the input property is being displayed inside the component, I changed it right here inside of my app, right? So they're different. But here's the cool thing. They could actually be tied together, right? So let's say, for example, you input something to an app using the input property, and then you manipulate that in some way inside of that value or something like that. And then you want to reference the input value and send it right back out. It's kind of like this loop, right? You can actually do that. So if I come back into my component and I come to the output record, here I'm actually hard coding this, but I could absolutely come here and I could say default props, right? That's the name of the component inside the component. And then I'm going to go to my input record property. That is my input property that I created. So I'll go back there, dot input record property, dot, and now I can reference that. So now it's badge URL, right? So now I'm including in this output parameter or output property a dynamic value. It doesn't have to have come in from the input property. It could be a variable or something else, right? A little bit more complex. This is very simple. It's literally showing just kind of a round trip of data coming in via the input property and then transferring directly to the output property and going back to the app. So theoretically, what should happen when I go back to the app in a moment, we should see them as the exact same badge being displayed. And if I go back, sure enough, there we are. May the open source be with you, right? And why is that? Again, it's because I'm passing this value in from my app, So when I look at the actual input record property right here, that value is the may the open source be with you image reference. That's getting passed into the component, just getting routed back over to the output, and that's coming back out here. And that's a natural image control inside of my app. Pretty cool. Okay, so now when it comes to these properties, specifically data properties, there's some features and characteristics that's noteworthy to talk about. Now, the first one is that there is a relationship between your default data and inside the component and your app, right? So you might say it's this kind of sort of contract. What is a kind of sort of contract? Well, when you're defining the data, it is expecting that data to be passed in, that type of data. So what we've done is we've defined a record as the data type for our input and output properties. So if I were to go in and try to pass in some other value, right, it's going to error. So for example, if I come into my component, I'm inside the app and I'm on the component and I'm going to come into the input side, right? Okay, so I've got badge name. So I'm just going to copy that, kind of paste it out, and I'm going to go test, right? Or test. So I'm passing a string. Now you see it errors and it says because there is an expected record value. Well, okay, that does make sense, right? We set it up as a record as the data type for our property. But this is where the kind of sort of contract comes in. I'm going to paste this back in, and you'd think that if this is what it's being expected as, because you can reference these things directly within the component, right? If you don't pass them, it would break, it would fail. So for example, if we didn't pass the badge URL, we would expect it to error because it's being used, right? It's being used as routing in to this display of the component right there, and then it's being rerouted back out to the output. So when I remove this, what happens? They just go away. There's no error. See, no error shows up, but it doesn't seem to care. Of course, it's not going to work appropriately, and it's not falling back to the value and the default value inside the component. And why is that? Why is it, if I'm not passing a URL, why does it not just use this value, right, that I've defined, or inside of the input record where I've got that? Why does it not just use that? Here it's showing it because we're inside the component, we're local. But why is it not showing it here now when we're representing a screen? Well, the reason is because we're still passing something, right? We're passing a record. And so in this case, the use of the record is all or nothing. You're not able to just say, well, I'm passing these properties of the record or these items in the record, but I'm not passing the URL. So go fall back to the URL default value. It seems to be that it's all or nothing, right? So in fact, I could even add another property value here and say, test value test, right? It doesn't complain about that. Now, I can't use this value inside of my component because it doesn't know that it's coming in. The component, I've just added this arbitrarily in the app. So the component doesn't know that I'm passing it. It has no way to reference or have known that I'm passing it in. So that kind of makes sense. Absolutely. But why it's not forcing this, I don't know. Why it's not erroring, I don't know if that was intended or a bug. I will say that in action and event, and then also in the function input and output properties, it enforces the entire schema. And you'll see that. I've got other videos. You can check them out, reference them. I'll include them here when they're ready. So check them out. But they do force the entire schema. In this case, it doesn't seem to be. It does force that there needs to be a record, but it's okay if that record doesn't match the entire expected schema or even includes extra data that it wouldn't be used or can't be used. So just be aware of that, kind of a gotcha. Again, it's kind of weird. Now, it's falling back. It doesn't error. I guess it kind of makes sense that it's not erroring because when you think about it, every control type or item or object or whatever inside of Power Apps is strongly typed and it has a default value. So in this case, what we were passing in is as a string, right? That is a string. So what it does is it just falls back to an empty string. And in case of most other data types, probably just falls back to whatever the default is there. I think the default for Boolean is false. And so it's going to fall back to whatever that is. So you do want to be able to test it. That's the great thing about default values. You can do testing right within your component and kind of understand how things are going to work. But again, some interesting characteristics specifically for these data property types. And so be aware of those. Still super cool, way more cool with action and event, which again, I encourage you to go take a look and check out those videos. But these are super cool using these default values, because you can kind of create this kind of sort of maybe contract between things, which gets better with action and event. So check it out. Okay, so lastly, I do want to mention that while inside of our component here, if I go back, we used both a input record or input property and an output property. We defined them both as records. You don't have to use them together. You don't have to use one or the other. You can use them, or you could use many of one and one of the other, or many of other, whatever combination you want, your heart desires. It's all up to you, right? I showed how you can route through in a kind of like this weird loop just to explain the concept, but bear in mind that you can kind of do whatever you want. These aren't required to be used together, but they are super powerful. So go play with them, check them out. Hey, put some comments in the chat. Let me know how you're using them. Would love to hear about it, and excited to start collaborating with y'all. Reach out. Let me know what you think. Like and subscribe also, please, to let me continue to make more of these videos. Would love to be able to boost some of these statistics to help me have more opportunity to make more content for y'all. So thank you all for watching. Appreciate it. See you in the next one.